Hello and welcome to the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Gini, Dietrich.
And let's get into the show. So I don't know. I'm feeling some energy now. So
I'm kind of amped up now.
You know, we've changed. If you're paying any attention at all, we've changed how we're doing the opening to the show now. So instead of the stock pre-recorded thing, we got that little bumper at the beginning. If you're watching in video, you get to see our pretty animated faces coming across the screen. And if you're listening, you just get that nice beat there to kind of feel the energy and get into this before you have to listen to Jenny and I go on and 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 on.
Well, you go on and on and on and on.
Wow, we're not starting in a good place here. You're already taking shots at me.
Well, it's my pleasure.
Fantastic. I'm sure the listeners appreciate it, even if I don't. All right. So something else that many of us don't appreciate is when we hear from a client that they're not too happy with one of our employees, that they've maybe got some performance issues or communications issues or something like that. And so this is a question that comes up pretty regularly in both of our practices. It's a question that came to me in a recent open Q&A I was doing for SAGA members. So I thought it would be a good question for us to address here in a little bit more depth than I was able to do in that sort of town hall style format. But I don't think any of us who have employees in any business, but particularly in the agency world, have ever managed to survive without having at least one complaint from a client.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Sometimes we get complaints about our own work. I mean, when many of us started out as solos, we got complaints. This isn't up to snuff. I don't like this. Blah blah blah.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. No, I mean, you and I, we're both perfect, which is why we advise other agencies because of our perfection. Mm-hmm. Yes. But I mean, so it's one thing when it's about your own work, because that I think is a lot easier for you to address because you know exactly what took place, you know what the truth or not is, and you can make your own assessment as to what you need to do. When it's a client calling you or emailing you to complain about one of your team members, it's a little more challenging.
And I would also add to that it could just be a personality issue. It's not always a performance issue. So the client may present it as a performance issue when that's not the case at all.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and so you almost have to be a detective at first, right? You need to figure out, where the truth is, because, the reality of all of these situations is that they're going to be he said, she said, she should, right. I can go through every possible permutation there. But if I do, I'll probably end up saying something nasty. So I'm not going to try to go through them that quickly because tongue twisters are not my specialty. But it's going to be one person said one thing, another person says another thing, because usually when you go to your employee, they've got a little bit of a different take on it. Now, you don't want to turn this into an inquisition, right? This is not, while you have to do some detective work, it is not a full-on investigation in most cases. I mean, obviously it depends on the severity of the complaint. If the complaint is, I'm getting a lot of typos in the work that I'm getting, or it's not timely, or, some of those are simpler. If it's just the work isn't up to par, well, that's more challenging, because then you got to figure out what par even is and make sure that there's agreement on that. Yeah,
I think you're right. There's probably different levels. And as we talk about all the time, it depends. So there could be a situation like I have a client who says that someone on my team is always late. And I'm like, it's a Zoom call. What do you mean she's always late? And he was like, well, he always shows up like between 4 and 5 minutes late. Okay, well, I can actually check that, right? Because it's in the software, because it's on our account. So I can actually check that. And she is always late. So I've set her calendar so that she arrives 5 minutes early because she thinks it's actually 10 o'clock instead of 10:00.
But see, now that only works
as long as she doesn't figure it out.
Right? Because for years, my wife would set her watch 5 minutes early. And so I would say to her, but you know that it is, so that doesn't really help any.
So does it help or not? Is she still, because she knows it's 5 minutes late, is she still, or 5 minutes early, she's still late?
I'm going to take the fifth here. She doesn't listen to this podcast, but
I'll ask her.
Great. I mean, well, it's a good question for you to ask because you're never late.
Oh, I'm late to this one all the time. All the time.
It's just because you disrespect your co-host.
I only disrespect you. This morning I was like right on time, and then my computer went bloop, and I was like, oh, come on.
And my dog ate my homework, Ginny.
I know. I'm always late.
Except I don't have a dog and never will, so, but anyway.
I mean, I say that in jest. Of course she knows that, but it's been part of the performance review to say you have to be early. You can't be late. You can't be on time. You have to be early. And then there are situations where many years ago I had a client who's still a client who told me he just wasn't going to work with somebody on my team. He's like, I just don't like her. And I was like, okay. So we took her off the account. I mean, and then it can progress from there. But I think you're right. You have to figure out what the issue is. If it's an issue that, like the client who said, I'm just not going to work with her, and you take them off the account and put them somewhere else, or is it, typos or showing up late or whatever it happens to be, that can be fixed. And
it's a balancing act because, your responsibility as an agency owner is absolutely to keep your client happy. But, if it's a good employee, you need to make sure that you're keeping them happy as well. Mm-hmm. So the way that you solve it for the client can't make it substantially worse with the employee and make them, resent the account or resent your reaction to it or those kinds of things. So this really does require some substantial diplomacy on your part as a leader to figure out how to navigate it to make sure that you're keeping both sides as happy as possible.
Yeah, and it's a really good point too, because you don't want to demoralize them or make them feel like they can't be trusted or the client's unhappy, and so they're demotivated and don't want to do the work, whatever it happens to be. Right. It is a nice balancing act. I think there's what I've learned over the years in terms of leading employees is just to be honest and say, hey, listen, this sucks. But this is the feedback I'm getting. Can we talk this through and figure out if there's a solution? And that honesty and transparency usually is pretty effective.
Right. And part of it depends too on whether or not this comes as a surprise to you as the manager, right? So if the client calls you up and says, Jim's writing is just, it's rough around the edges. He's clearly not proofreading or spell checking or whatever. And that, right? You're like, okay, yeah, that's kind of what I've seen too. First of all, on the one hand, that's good, right? Because you're not seeing something out of left field.
Totally, you're right.
On the other hand, it means that it's something that you were aware of and haven't yet addressed. But I mean, let's be realistic here. A lot of us allow certain employee shortcomings to slide because it's the easier route.
Sure.
Right. Sometimes we don't want to deal with it. And if we can, skate by and the client's still happy, it's not necessarily the right thing to do, but we've all done it at one point or another. And so, but you have to ask yourself, are you letting it slide too far? Should you have addressed this sooner? Because a lot of times, at least in my case, where a client has come to me, it hasn't been a surprise and it's things I probably should have buckled down on sooner. Now, in the case where it does come out of left field, well, that's different because that's really when you have to figure out, is it a real problem or is this a client being difficult?
Yeah, and maybe it's not even always that they're being difficult, but it's that your employee is not grasping the subject matter or has the expertise to do the kinds of work that you've committed to doing. Or, I mean, there were tons of different reasons for it. Right. One of the challenges that I've had in growing my agency, and this has been a real challenge, is clients will say to me, well, I'd rather just work with you. And I'm like,
yeah, that's fine, but you're going to have to pay about 25 times as much because I have a very limited amount of my time available. Yeah.
And that's how I've solved it in many cases is I will say, okay, yeah, but it costs this amount. And either one of two things happen today. They say, oh no, we're good. Or yeah, it's important to us that we get your caliber level of work. And that's been a real challenge because it doesn't matter. I've had that challenge no matter what level the employees are. I can have somebody really experienced and the client just doesn't feel like they're getting the same level, even though they are, or probably even better than they were with me. So, having your name on the door, I think, is a real challenge from an employee perspective as well because of that. And then that's demoralizing to the employee too, right?
Right.
Have the
Absolutely.
client say something like that.
Well, and I think, and we've said this before on the show when talking about business development, it's so important to have your team exposed to the client during the prospect stage so that they don't become attached just to you. They're becoming attached to the team and they're seeing the expertise from your team so that there isn't that pressure for you to be the one that's always on the call or always sending the email or doing the work or those kinds of things, because that will destroy your ability to grow as an agency. And it's demoralizing, not just to your team member, but to you too, because you're then in sometimes even if someone's willing to pay my hourly rate, I still don't want to do the work, right? It's not that, it's just not the kind of work that, almost 30 years into my career.
Yep.
Or, almost 30 years this year. Great. That's scary.
No.
My first full-time job was October 1st, 1991. Yep.
Ooh.
Yeah, I started young, but I was still in college. But anyway, so let's not talk about me being old. You have plenty of opportunities to do that at some point, I'm sure. And a lot of this comes down to expectations, right? Another thing that I harp on all the time, because most client agency relationships go sour because expectations were never aligned or ended up diverging somewhere along the way. Mm-hmm. And so when you've got a complaint about an employee, it may be that their expectations are unreasonable, right? And you touched on this earlier as far as expertise. Clients, in my experience, often believe that their agency should become just as much of an expert in their subject matter as they are.
Yep.
And the reality is that if you've got a client that you're working on a few hours a week, you're just not going to be as expert as they are spending all day, not just in their company, but in their industry and all that. And they probably have years of experience leading up to that as well. So even if you're dedicated full time, you're working for a larger agency and you are full time working for one client, you're not going to have that same expertise for a long, long time.
Well, and not only that, but you don't have the opportunity to, even if you sit in one meeting a day or, 2 meetings a week or whatever happens to be, you're not in the internal meetings. You're not typically you're not in the town halls unless you're doing them for the client, but you're not in the big meetings where they're talking about changes in messaging or changes in strategy, or you're just not part of those meetings because you're not in the business all day every day. And it's a real challenge to be able to become that expert in their business. You may have industry expertise, but in their business overnight, it's really challenging.
Right. And sometimes the employee has allowed the expectations to shift over time, too. This particularly comes true when it has to do with turnaround times for things, because that's what clients will often complain, that they're not getting things quick enough. And what I've seen in a lot of those cases is it's because the individual employee has tried to over-deliver, and over a period of time, they've conditioned the client to expect faster turnaround than what you were originally promising.
Yeah.
And so we've talked ad nauseum about the risks of over-servicing from a profit perspective, but there's also a risk in the over-servicing as far as how it affects the relationship overall. Because if you think about it in terms of, like when you've got a house that's got a fence built on your neighbor's property, and the longer that fence sits there, the more likely you are to have a constructive use easement available to you, where basically, because that fence has been on their property the whole time, it's basically become your property now because they didn't complain for long enough, and we're not going to get into all the legal stuff around that. But it's the same thing with a client. If you promised 2-day turnaround, but your employee is always giving 1-day or same-day turnaround on things, and they do this for months and months and months, well, now the client expects that. Yep. And so it's harder. So if they call up and say, well, I'm not getting the same-day turnaround because, maybe they did this when business was slow. Particularly we've seen this last year, right? A lot of agencies had a slow period in March, April, May. And so if you've now said, okay, well, we can just turn things around quicker because we're not as overloaded, now the businesses are coming back, it's hard to recondition the clients back to a longer turnaround time. So that's one of those areas where expectations can end up being reset inadvertently and perhaps even without your knowledge as an agency owner or leader. And so it's something you need to stay on top of with your team so that you understand it and you can head this off before the client has a chance to complain.
And I think it goes even beyond over servicing or over delivering. It goes to things like responding to emails after hours, or if they're texting you, which has become the new client thing, and you respond immediately,
which is just terrible, by the way. It's just terrible. Do not let your clients text you.
Oh, they do.
They don't text me because I don't give them the number, but
That's me.
Texting I think is terrible for so many reasons. First of all is the time nature of it, but the second is it's almost impossible to accurately track texts that need follow-up. Right? So it's not an email. I can put it in a folder. I can put a star on it. I can do something. I can copy it over to Evernote. Whatever I want to do to make sure I don't overlook it. But on texts, if I don't deal with it immediately, I know it's hard for me to remember to come back. Same problem. I used to use Skype a lot when I was working in an international business, and that was the easiest way for everybody to communicate effectively. And so I would always say to people, don't send a request that you don't need an instant response on via Skype, because I will never, ever remember to go back to it.
Yeah, and it gets lost. You can't search it. You can't put it in folders. You can't. Yeah.
So my advice is just stop them from sending you texts on anything that's non-urgent. And again, it's where you set expectations, right? So maybe you do allow them to text you generally, but you do what I did with my colleagues regarding Skype. If it's something that doesn't need an immediate response, send an email. And sometimes I would just respond and say, can you send this to me in an email? Something like that to continuously condition them. Yeah,
and I think that's right, is you have to set expectations, you have to set boundaries, and you have to continue to condition them. And I have a former employee who, no matter how often we talked about these things, and we talked about it a lot, she continued to over service, and then she got herself in trouble for exactly what you were saying, because the client began to expect it. And then all of a sudden we had this huge issue with the client thinking that she wasn't performing when she was actually delivering time in a timely manner. She just wasn't doing it as quickly as she had been, but she had spent 2.5 years doing it that way. And then suddenly she was like, oh, I have other priorities. I don't want to continue to do this, and slowed it down. And the client flipped.
Yep.
But she didn't listen to me. So, it was her own fault.
Yeah, which feels good to say, but it may be her fault, but it's ultimately your problem.
Of course. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, and so it is something you need to be aware of, and I think we've talked about, I think, some of the things that are on the simpler variety to deal with. They're still painful, but they're simpler. I think the most difficult is where the client has come to you with a concern, and it's more over the quality of the work, right? So it's not responsiveness, it's not blatant typos, that kind of stuff. It's where the quality just isn't there, whether it's strategic or the content that's being created, where it's just not quite right. And you look at it and you say, yeah, it's not. It really needs to be stepped up. I think that's the most difficult as a manager to deal with, because you know it's a problem, but how do you get that kind of improvement without just spending a ton of your own time on it? So that I think is the one I've struggled with the most, and I know that I've got one client right now who's struggling with that very directly with one of their employees.
Yeah, I actually have a couple clients who are struggling with that as well. And with one of them, we've actually hired a coach for her employee, because she wants to invest in this employee's growth and help and mentor and coach and all this. So we've hired a coach specific to writing in a technical manner for a B2B organization. So that's where she's spending her time. It's not an overnight solution.
Right.
And so she's had to hire a contractor to help out in the interim. So it's costing her some money. She's having to invest for sure. But that's the way that we're solving that particular one.
Yep. And the situation that I've got is pretty similar, although we're trying to use some third-party training resources first, webinars, training,
Sure. Yep.
virtual trainings, and that kind of stuff. So part of the thing is the first assessment you have to make is, can this employee improve in whatever area it is? I mean, have they tapped out? Are they, are they just years away from having the expertise or the skill or whatever to get there? So you need to determine, is it reasonable to get them where the client wants them and where you think they should be going? And if so, then you have to decide how you want to invest in it. And you really do. I mean, I think one of the hardest transitions that new agency owners or even experienced agency owners as they're growing and letting go to take on is that the idea that they're a coach. They have to be coaching their employees and helping them to improve. They can't step in and just do the work for them. They can't step in and micromanage them. They've got to find a way to help those individuals improve their skills, whether that's by working more with colleagues, getting some external help from a coach or a training system or something like that. But you need to make that mindset shift. You need to decide if that employee is worth that investment. And if not, then maybe you need to make a change.
Yeah. And it could be, the change could be putting them on, oh my gosh, we've got a blizzard outside. I just looked up. Holy cow. Sorry. Was not expecting that.
Chicago in the wintertime, it snows, right? I
mean, it must be lake effect. Wow. So it does, can you move the employee to a different account where they'll be able to flourish, or do they have to go somewhere else? And
right, or can you bring someone else in your team onto that account for part of the time to serve as a bit of a mentor and a shepherd to guide them through. You also need to understand, how does your employee learn? Will they learn better with a one-on-one coach? Will they learn better through some video training, or by going, when we ever have in-person again, to an in-person training? Different people have different approaches, and so you need to try to find out from them. So what I like to do is I like to talk with the employee and sort of talk about, here's where I want you to get, and try to get some of their feedback about, how they would like to get there. What are their ideas? So we can throw them around and try to collaboratively figure out what the solution is. Because you don't want to come in and just tell the employee, these are the 7 corrective steps you're going to take. Because I'll tell you, most people do not react particularly well to that, right?
Nope.
You have to find a way where either you make it their own idea, or at least they feel like they were invested in the decision. And that's how you actually get change to take place. And so again, it's tough. It's not, I know that this is not my general mindset. My general mindset is, why can't you just do it right the first time? I could do that in 5 seconds. Why is it taking you so long, right? I consciously had to work on that over years and years. I did. And I'm still not perfect at it.
I'm whistling and looking away because I'm the same way.
And look, I think a lot of the people listening are, because that's one of the ways that you end up getting ahead, because you are, a type A, you're driven.
Yeah.
You want to improve yourself. You want to have a high standard. And the reality is, as much as we want it, not every employee, not even every good employee, has that same mindset. There are plenty of people who will do a great job for your agency, but they're never going to be rock stars. But you don't need a rock star in every single role.
Nope.
And we've seen plenty of agencies over the years fail when they try to put together, Hall of Fame style teams or all-star teams.
Yep.
You need to have a good mix of people, and some people who are just really skilled at certain bits of it, but maybe not, overall rock stars. So these are all very difficult things for owners to understand, but they're so critical if you're going to be in a position where you can keep both your clients and your team happy.
Yeah, I 100% totally agree. I remember probably 7 or 8 years ago hearing it described as A plus A and B players on your team, and you need them all. You need every single one of them, because the B players are going to be really solid employees who do the work, get it done, deliver on time. Are they going to be the ones that are like, give me more, or let me go to that event, or no, they're not, and that's okay. Right. The A players are going to be the ones that want to move up the ladder and get to the A plus, and then the A plus, of course, are your rock stars. But you can't have an agency full of rock stars. You just can't.
Right. Right.
Like,
And
why
so-
you can't have an agency full of B players either.
Right. It really is. It's a healthy mix that you have to have. And obviously, the more it skews towards the A players, the better.
Sure.
Certainly you don't want a lot of C, D, and F players. Right?
No, I wouldn't want
That's a problem. Too many agencies do carry those people too far. So these communications from clients where they express a concern, look at them as an opportunity to evaluate, is this person in the wrong seat on the bus? Do they just need help on the bus, or should they get off the bus altogether? Mm-hmm. And you really need to evaluate those, not be overly reactionary, but you need to evaluate it as part of the process.
Yeah, 100%. This is a really hard one, and this has been something I've struggled with the entire time I've had my agency.
Yeah, and you're always going to struggle with it. I mean, it's reality that you cannot be a manager of people without having these challenges, these difficult conversations with clients, these difficult conversations with employees, and frankly, the difficult choices that you have to make over time. So hopefully we've given people a little bit of an idea as to how they might address this when the inevitable happens and they do get this call, if they haven't already gotten it. And hopefully there's some constructive things that they can take away and improve how they're handling client concerns about employees going forward.
Yes, indeedy.
And so with that, Jenny, we're going to wrap up this episode, and we've got a whole new set of ending credits. So if you usually just stop listening right now, don't, because it's different. It's all different. So at least listen to the next 45 seconds or so.
Oh, I can't wait. All
of
right.
credits so that you know what the new sign-off is. And with that, I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Jenny Dietrich.
And it depends. Thank you for listening to the Agency Leadership Podcast. You can watch or listen to every episode by visiting agencyleadershippodcast.com or subscribing on your favorite podcast player. We would also love it if you would leave a rating or review at iTunes or wherever you go to find podcasts. Be sure to check out Ginny Dietrich at spinsucks.com and join the SpinSucks community at spinsucks.com/spin-sucks-community. You can learn more about me, Chip Griffin, at small-agency-growth.com, where you can also sign up for a free community membership to engage with other agency leaders. The Agency Leadership Podcast is distributed on the FIR Podcast Network, where you can find lots of other communications-oriented podcasts. Just visit www.firpodcastnetwork.com. We welcome your feedback and suggestions and look forward to being back with you again next week.